For 2 billion people, their entire worldview rests on a single historical premise, that a first-century Jewish preacher named Jesus of Nazareth actually existed. But outside the pews, a vocal movement of skeptics and fringe scholars is asking a sharp, provocative question. What if the most famous man in human history is a complete fabrication? This is known as the Christ myth theory. One of its most prominent academic voices is Dr. Robert Price, a theologian who argues that the biblical Jesus is entirely mythological. Price points to a glaring gap in the historical record. During the exact years Jesus supposedly lived and preached, not a single Roman or Jewish writer wrote down a word about him. The contemporary silence is absolute. Price uses what we could call the Superman analogy. If you take the gospel stories and strip away the walking on water, the multiplying loaves, and the resurrections, you don't find a mundane historical man underneath. You just find an empty void. The earliest written gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, didn't appear immediately. They were written 35 to 40 years after the traditional date of the crucifixion. To mythicists, that multi-decade gap reveals the truth. They argue early Christians didn't record a real life. They invented a dying and rising demigod from scratch to fill a theological vacuum. If those foundational texts are purely fabricated mythology, the entire historical edifice of the religion collapses. Mainstream secular historians, however, reject this theory. Dr. Bart Ehrman, an agnostic scholar of early Christianity, argues that the mythicist case relies on a deep misunderstanding of how ancient history works. We expect real-time documentation today, but applying that standard to minor regional figures in the ancient world guarantees failure. Almost no one from the first century has contemporary literary records. Take the high priest Caiaphas, the most powerful religious figure in Judea, or Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Neither of these men have surviving narrative accounts written during their lifetimes. If we demand contemporary documents to prove Jesus existed, we also have to erase the powerful politicians who ruled over him. Expecting a paper trail for a poor, rural preacher is an impossible standard that inevitably yields false negatives. Historians like Mogens Mueller agree that the Gospels are highly theological texts, written generations after the fact. Rigorous scholars bypass them entirely to find an earlier baseline. That baseline is the Apostle Paul, who wrote letters in the 50s CE, well before any Gospel. In Galatians, Paul casually recounts visiting Jerusalem. He spent 15 days with Peter and met James, whom he explicitly identifies as the brother of Jesus. Paul is recording a mundane, interpersonal meeting with a literal sibling. You cannot meet the flesh and blood brother of an invented cosmic space demon. To test these ancient claims, historians rely on an analytical tool called the criterion of embarrassment. It assumes that authors are highly unlikely to invent details that actively damage their own cause. In the first century, the Jewish expectation for a Messiah was a conquering, victorious warrior who would overthrow Roman rule. Instead, the early Christians preached about a rural carpenter who was publicly tortured and executed by the state. If you are trying to win converts in the Roman Empire, a crucified savior is a massive, illogical stumbling block. The Romans used crucifixion specifically to humiliate rebels and prove they had no divine protection. Nobody would fabricate a story that completely undermined their own theological sales pitch. The early Christians preached a crucified Messiah because they were stuck with the inconvenient historical fact that their leader had been executed. The criterion of embarrassment shows that the core of the Jesus narrative was constrained by historical reality rather than creative freedom. The mythicists are entirely correct about one thing. The Jesus we see in the later Gospels is heavily mythologized, draped in the supernatural tropes of ancient heroes. This stratigraphic diagram illustrates how modern scholars separate the Christ of faith, the theological construct built up over decades, from the Jesus of history. By visually peeling back the layers of mythology, historians isolate the earthly preacher at the center. Secular scholars do not need to validate virgin births, miracles, or resurrections to acknowledge the existence of the man himself. Rigorous historical methodology gives us the tools to extract reality from ancient legend. We don't have to dismiss the past entirely just because it was wrapped in mythological packaging.